I'm live. I'm reading A Lot to Remember. It's a journey through France, or several journeys through France Joan Marshall Grant did. This was published in 1962, and it has a lovely little dedication to Denys and Charles with love for A Lot to Remember. Joan Marshall Grant passed away in 1989, and she was a writer of her own far memories. She wrote a lot about her reincarnations and so on. Anyway, we are here at chapter 10 of Fear and Fidelity. The road up the Cirque d'Antoine turned south from the D30 about a mile to the west of the Château de Montal. Artois is a beautiful village, and its manor house looks down at its reflection in an ornamental lake set in weeping willows. Beyond the lake, vineyards slope up to the rock face, which becomes increasingly precipitous until it reaches the crest of the gorge, where a stream cascades over a sheer drop and becomes a plentiful source of écrevisses. Charles and I have enjoyed many of the freshwater crayfish, although I have never succeeded in catching any, for we went to the Manoir d'Antoine nearly every day while we were at Saint-Céré, because our host, Jacques de Colombe, thought it would be more likely to write industriously there than in our hotel bedroom. However, it was Charles who worked on his manuscript, and I spent most of my time gossiping with the family. Before knowing the Colombes, I thought my instinctive gesture of so often shaking hands might be redundant even in France. But I soon learned that this fear was groundless, and that to shake hands with everyone when I first saw them in the morning, and again before I left the house, was by no means enough. Courtesy demanded that everyone shook hands with everyone else, both before and after luncheon, even if two of the participants had been chatting to each other 10 minutes earlier in another room, and was the prelim and colophon of each subsequent encounter. My record score was 11 handshakes with the same person between meeting them at 10 in the morning and leaving the house at 4:30. But until the Colombes came to dine with us at the Truc d'Ordet, I had not seen this pleasing custom in full flower. The proprietors, Monsieur and Madame Gaboriau, met Monsieur le Marquis and Madame la Marquise at the doorway of their hotel and shook hands. Madame Gaboriau's parents, Monsieur and Madame Landau, then came forward and shook hands. The Gaboriaus were by now stationed at the door of the dining room. As we entered, we shook their hands. After dinner, the chef, who was of course requested to accept fulsome congratulations, shook hands all around, both before and after he had drunk with us a digestif. There was another round of handshaking when the Gaboriaus came to inquire whether we had enjoyed our meal. Another with the same partners at the dining room door, another outside the hotel, and the final one through the open window of the car. Jacques de Colombe's mother had her 80th birthday the day after we first went to Artois. She was too crippled by arthritis to walk downstairs, but sitting in a high-backed chair in her bedroom, her hair vividly white under the ivory lace of her scarf, and her eyes brighter than the antique diamonds on her fragile hands, she was gay as a young girl. "I do not believe in phantoms," said Jacques as he introduced us to her, "but you will find that my mother shares many of your ideas, for she too has her visions. not believed in my visions, as Jacques calls them, he would not have been born. So while he gives us our coffee, I shall allow myself the pleasure of telling you the story, and hope that my son, who has often heard it before, will have the forbearance not to interrupt me. After telling Jacques to move my chair closer to her, pleading a slight deafness, which was only an excuse for asking me to repeat a remark when my French was more incomprehensible than usual, she began. I was 16 when I dreamt a dream which changed the course of my life. In the dream, I found myself standing at my bedroom window, knowing I waited for someone, although I did not yet know who he would be or why he came. In the bright moonlight, I saw a man walking towards me across the lawn. I could see his face very clearly and knew he was either very ill or in great pain. He stood looking up at me and then cried out in a voice of anguish, "You must wait for me. I cannot come to you yet, but you must promise to wait for me." My heart went out to him, but I could neither move nor speak. Then he turned away and went slowly into the shadow of the dark trees. But as I watched him go, I saw that he was wearing the tropical uniform of an army officer, and that his left leg had been amputated above the knee. In my dream, it did not seem incongruous that in spite of this mutilation, he walked without a limp. When I woke, the dream was still so vivid that it emboldened me to inform my parents that they must break off the plans they were making for my betrothal. They were displeased, for they considered their choice for me would be a most suitable alliance. And when I told them that nothing would make me break my promise to the man I intended to marry, they became incensed. It was difficult to convince them I had not been indulging in furtive assignations, but at last I managed to satisfy them that I had met my lover only in a dream, at which my mother was relieved and my father became even more angry, seeing himself as the victim of a daughter's hysterical whim. Looking back over the years, I can sympathize with their anxieties, but at the time I thought them utterly heartless. I defended myself from their arguments with tears and tantrums, and when these failed, took to my bed and refused to eat. As in those days, it was quite fashionable for girls to retreat into a decline when crossed in love. They eventually became sufficiently alarmed to summon the family doctor. He at last had the wit to realize that my malaise was not true to tight lacing, but suspecting an affliction of the lungs, he advised the current remedy, a change of air. This verdict would gain me a respite, if no more, so I coughed convincingly until I was sent off to a friend of my mother's, who had a daughter of my own age. You can imagine my feelings when in this girl's bedroom I saw a photograph of the man of my dream. To my overwhelming relief, she told me that the photograph was not of her fiancé, as I had feared, but of her brother. I was, of course, not in the least surprised to hear that his regiment was in Indochina, for his uniform had shown me that he was in a hot climate. But why were his family unconcerned by the loss of his leg? It was not until the following morning that I summoned the courage to ask such a pertinent question, and his sister was bewildered, as they had not received news that he had even been wounded. Three days later the letter arrived, containing the confirmation for which I had been waiting. When he was wounded, he had refused to allow his family to be informed, hoping to spare them needless anxiety. Then the wound became gangrenous, and when the doctor told him that the leg must be amputated, he thought the battlefield on which he would die would be the operating table. But he did not die, for although he did not tell anyone about this until much later, Just before the orderlies came to put him on the stretcher, he saw a girl standing beside his bed. A girl who said that he must get well because he had promised to marry her. Jacques' father kept his promise, but before so doing, he kept me in suspense for nearly 2 years by refusing to see anyone except his family. How many letters I wrote to his sister before I was at last invited to visit them again. How I tormented myself with fears that he might marry someone else. But at last we met, and he told me that it was a vision of me which had prevented him from dying, but he had argued himself out of the belief that I was just a girl who was waiting for him to come home and marry her, and decided instead he had seen an angel sent by his mother's prayers to tell him that it was his duty to go on living. Jacques perhaps became, because he wished to conceal that he was moved by her story, and said rather brusquely, "I shall believe in phantoms when I see one, but I'm prepared to admit that odd things happen, and there are houses which I should prefer not to own. It is now my mother's turn to listen while I'll tell you about such a house in which one of my cousins had to live after she married a Hungarian. He bred horses there and sired 14 children. It was quite a modern house, built about 1790, and inconvenient even for Hungary, with 2 wings, one occupied by the parents and the other by the hordes of children, joined only by a ballroom and orangery, disused since the family fortunes declined after the Kaiser's war. My cousin might at least have been spared the knowledge that the place was haunted, had she not decided to engage an English governess. They already had 2 governesses, a Frenchwoman and a German, who were so jealous when they heard that another one was coming that, to give the English girl some privacy, she was allotted a small suite above the orangery. These rooms had not been used for many years, but they were refurbished, and on the evening she arrived she seemed to be delighted with them. The footman who carried the dinner tray up to her sitting room mentioned that she appeared to be very cheerful and had an excellent appetite, and that she intended to finish her unpacking before she went to bed. Jacques paused to make sure he had our full attention, but the poor girl did not go to bed. When the footman took up her breakfast tray, he found her still fully dressed in the sitting room, but she was dead, and on her face was an expression of such terror that the doctor who did the post-mortem could only conclude that she had died of fright. This unfortunate incident was glossed over by calling it a heart attack, and so that the servants should not start rumours about the home being haunted, it was decided that the next governess should have the same room. Perhaps my cousin did not fully share her husband's robust attitude, for she engaged a middle-aged Swiss to teach her children English, and when this woman arrived was relieved to find that she not only had an excellent English accent, but was even more phlegmatic than her references and photographs had suggested. In fact, in a letter written to me that evening, she called the new governess the Prussian Grenadier, and said it was a comfort to know that such a woman could not possibly be affected by phantoms, for she was too solid even to notice when the children giggled as she stroked her bristly moustache. However, a letter written 3 days later proved my cousin to have been unduly sanguine. This woman was also found in the sitting room, having not gone to bed. She was alive, but raving mad. So far as I know, she is still in the Swiss asylum, where she was eventually placed at the request of her family. My cousin brought them an annuity to cover the fees. Jacques took off his glasses and polished them carefully before continuing. These two unfortunate incidents were enough to cause the rooms to remain locked for 3 years. Hungarians tend to be superstitious. Then, although her husband disliked any mention of the subject, my cousin could not resist bringing it up when the conversation at a dinner party turned to the supernatural. Among the guests were 2 young officers who had been friends since childhood. Staunch skeptics, they demanded to be allowed to spend the night in the haunted room, and their host, perhaps through fear of being laughed at, gave his permission. The ordeal started gaily enough. Servants were sent to light the fire in both rooms and to make sure there was an ample supply of candles. Tokai, thermos flasks of black coffee, and a cold collation were provided for the girl. Neither of the young men seemed in the least nervous, although one of them took his pistol with him, declaring that he would fire it at anyone who was foolish enough to try to scare them by masquerading as a ghost. By the morning, they were both dead, but they had not died of fright. One of them had shot the other through the head and then killed himself by firing a bullet into his own mouth. Before I could say anything, Jacques gestured to me not to disturb his mother, who had fallen asleep. When she knows the story, my voice does not keep her awake, he said wistfully, as he held open the door. Then, more briskly, after he had carefully shut it behind us, the third unfortunate episode caused my cousin to insist on having the rooms demolished. As events have turned out, this was a pity, for the place is now occupied by communists, and the phantom could have played splendid jokes on a Russian general or a commissar. That is the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11 is entitled Books of the Black Art.